naturally think of the stars, solar systems, galaxy, the distant reaches of the universe.
But space has another dimension to explore, not outward, but inward, into all the basic elements of everything there is on our planet.
Here, a miniature world of space exists, a world filled with constant motion, one that went undetected for centuries. It is the world of the atom.
Welcome to the Free Radical Media Podcast. I am Eric Picard, ESP, and I'm joined by my co-host, as always, Patrick.
Hey there.
Tonight is a little bit more of a somber topic than we have been dealing with recently. Tonight, we're going to talk about Israel-Palestine, the Gaza Strip, the region of the world that they call the Levant, Canaan, the Holy Land, various assorted names throughout history. I assume that most listeners are vaguely aware of the conflict there. I'm not going to go into too much background now, but really what we're going to talk about, we're talking about this in the wake of the 2014 conflict. The official dates given 8 July to the 26th of August when the nominal ceasefire was negotiated. The Israelis call it Operation Protective Edge. Another one of those kind of overly patriotic terms. The conflict has left some 2,200 people dead, the vast majority of them being residents of the Gaza Strip. It's not a pleasant topic to talk about, and certainly it hasn't been pleasant to watch it unfold. Tonight we're going to be joined by a first-generation Palestinian American. She's a student, very active in the local community here. She's a friend of the show, Salam Farhan. Salam, welcome.
Thank you.
So I guess really. Why don't we just get started with what, your background? You know, what's your background? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I am, as you previously said, a first-generation Palestinian American. I was born and raised in northeastern Ohio, and the reason this issue is so important, other than the fact that I am a human who cares about other humans, is that my parents were actually refugees directly from the occupation of Palestine by Zionist Israel. So it's definitely not something that I can, nor do I want to ever escape. It's a part of who I am, although I was not a refugee of that place. My parents were. So, so I guess that's just where I'm coming from in terms of conflict. Still very close to my family. I mean, oftentimes you hear people talk about this conflict as being so old and it's been happening for so long. When in reality, it's only been, a generation, like around 60 years, you know what I mean? So I'm not sure if that's sort of like a different way to frame, the situation is to make it seem played out, or as if there is no way to solve this problem because it's been happening for so long and it's just natural that it's this way. That's not the case. So, yeah. a little about me. And like you said, I am interested in all sorts of issues. Locally, I really enjoy community gardening and other community social and environmental justice activities, and enjoy furthering my education as I'm doing.
Right. And you're right. I think it's important for everybody to understand, a human being is not one thing. You know what I mean? A human being is not their ethnicity or their cultural heritage. Merely, people are very, dynamic, and I mean, really, something like this we should all be aware of. So, a conflict like this we should all feel for, regardless of what our cultural background is. You know what I mean? Obviously, it's very
Sure.
in your consciousness because of, your parents being Palestinian refugees. But I think it's kind of like the moral imperative for everyone to be aware of these issues,
Right.
So tell us a little bit about your family then, if you would. Like, where are they from regionally? I mean, were they from Gaza?
Great. No, actually. So my family was originally from I guess you could call it a suburb, a little farm town outside of Jerusalem called Al-Malha, which actually translates to the salty. So as a geology student, I'm interested one day in going there to discover whether or not salt has anything really to do with the namesake. But so yes, Al-Malha, about a short, walk to and from Jerusalem, not too far away, but definitely considered smaller town. That was like the farm area. Beautiful olive trees were grown there, tropical fruits, what we would consider tropical, I guess, like figs and mangoes and cactus pears.
Yeah.
Yum. So that was pretty much the lifestyle there. Is very much just, farming, very close-knit communities. Everybody knows everybody, or, even now in the States, like my parents know people who they grew up with from there, and then, just ended up finding again over the years since they left.
Yeah.
And a lot of the income from that was just, taking your harvest to Jerusalem, to the bigger city, and selling them there at markets, right? So it was a very simplistic life, very close-knit communities and family-oriented society. And so that's where my father was from, actually. Okay. My mother was from Bethlehem, and unfortunately, when she was very young, some of the first steps of the military occupation started. So her and her family moved when she was very young to a town called Al-Bira, which means the well, which a lot of Palestinians in our area are from that town. So, which was also a very small town. All the communities, even those communities that you would consider bigger cities in Palestine, like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, were still very close-knit, very diverse. I mean, with the majority of like Arab Muslims, but it was definitely very diverse, with all people of different culture backgrounds as well as different religious backgrounds. Sure. And yeah, it was just a beautiful, very beautiful place. And sorry, I like lose my words thinking about the situation with all the different stories my parents have told me. But, probably one of the most moving stories from my parents' history was when my mother and her family, she has 6 siblings, and there was word that another military offensive was going to be taken on in a town near Al-Bira, and so everybody just carried what they could. Everyone in the town, almost everyone in the town, including my mother and her family, pretty much they left with what they had on their backs and, what they could carry, expecting to come back home, and started walking towards Jordan, to, just to walk towards safety, and they had family in Jordan. So, as she described it to me several times, that it was just so dark, right? And people are just walking through that desert environment, and there's just like hundreds and hundreds of people and families walking, because in these small towns, you didn't really need a vehicle. It wasn't common at the time for people to really have needs like that, or
Right.
So everyone's just walking to leave, and she recalled to me all these times of like the fighter jets flying overhead and not knowing like whether those were, fighter jets from, a country trying to assist Palestinians in this, or whether they were, Israeli planes. So anyone the few people who did have vehicles were driving also through in the same direction very slowly and with their lights off in the middle of the night, as to not attract the attention of those fighter jets. God forbid they were coming to cause harm to those people.
Right.
Very fortunately, one of the men who was driving a small car knew my grandfather, my mother's father, and so my grandfather desperately begged him to put his several children and wife in the car and help them get to Jordan safely and more quickly than by foot, of course. And he agreed. I don't ask me how they all fit in a small car. But, when your life is at risk, you do what you need to do, right? So they got in. There was times at which they had to stop, at which they exited the vehicle and ran into a barn-type structure because, the environment had become a little hostile. There had been, like, gunshots. And so, they took cover for some time and then got back on their way, made it to Jordan. Staying with my great aunt, who actually just recently passed away, and may she rest in peace. They would listen to, the radio every evening for the several days that they were in Jordan. And, on the radio, they were announcing the last names of the families and the people who were now safe to return back to their homes in all the different parts of the West Bank. Which at the time wasn't called the West Bank. It was just
Right.
And she said, each night, their name was not read, and they would just cry. Imagine, like 7 children. Imagine being a parent, seeing your children have to go through this and not having any control over this situation, not having anything other than what you wore out of the house. And long story short, their last name was never called. My mother and her siblings, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents were never, ever able to return back to their home. And some people tried, though, even if they weren't called. Many people did go back and, stood up for what was theirs, and some of them succeeded in keeping their homes. And actually, Elbira is known for many people who did have whatever that it was that it took to stand up for their homes, right? And also at that time, the international community was not as biased as it is now. And so they did, I think, have more support internationally to keep their homes and keep their land and their farms. And but my family, my grandfather was not willing to do this, considering how many children he had.
Yeah.
Even if he were to go by himself to try to stand up for their home, if his family lost him, they would be at a complete loss. So my mother and her family started from scratch in Jordan. My mother and her siblings attended a United Nations school. These schools became popular. I think every time, a refugee situation happens at that level, of course the UN comes in and upholds certain responsibilities like education, right? And maybe basic necessities are met. But what are you really giving these people who just lost their whole everything else in their life? What defines them? They just lost, their identity.
Right. It's not a good substitute for the sovereignty of your your cultural people.
Definitely. As for my father, his family did not leave. My grandfather actually just joined the British military at the time that the occupation, occurred. And so, the country of Palestine, due to like the small town feel of it, there was no need for like real military structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't as just how it's so organized here in the Western world, or just even in most countries nowadays in the developed world. We have, you definitely have like a police department system. You definitely have a military. There was no need for things like that at the time. So so my grandfather joined this army, didn't know what he was getting into, and they sent him off to training, and he was gone for a long time while my father, may he rest in peace, was, growing up. And my father actually grew up in a tent as a refugee in Palestine, but still not able to go back to the home that they were kicked out of in Al-Malha, and grew up on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem as a refugee, in every sense of the word. Like I said, the first 3 years of his life, he was raised in a tent, with his mother giving and finding whatever she could to sustain them, while my grandfather was gone as a very young man in the military. And as my grandfather returned, and they were still in this state, and my father got older, and my grandmother kept having more children once my grandfather came back, and the overwhelmingness of that kind of situation, without a stable place for shelter, without a stable income of food or any kind of currency to get you food. My father, at a very young age, in his teenage years, he finished school early, and traveled abroad to Kuwait and to Lebanon and to Egypt, and studied and furthered his education, sending back everything he ever accomplished, whether it was money or any other supply, back to his family in Palestine. So that they could support his siblings. And his siblings didn't even know who he was. As a 17-year-old, he had left Palestine and worked his hardest to do everything he could to better that situation for them, right? So he taught art. He became an art teacher after going to university, and was a teacher for several years to try to do that. So I think that's kind of a beautiful thing too, is that although it was such a desperate situation, I can only imagine the beauty of studying art and becoming an artist, and having that be your means of supporting your refugee family, right?
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
Verily there is verily there is ease within hardship, right? And I just think that that's of course it's all a means of attitude, I suppose, if you can see it in that way. But I like to think of it that way because there probably wasn't much else good going on for a refugee, a young man like that, at the time. So
well, it shows you,
that's my family.
like the human spirit, it's so resilient. I mean, we could find the the light coming out of the cracks. It's
Right.
it's a beautiful thing, and especially people who have suffered great hardship, tend to have these beautiful souls.
Sure.
But I mean, it's such a sadly common story. I mean, so many so many Palestinians, the amount of Palestinian controlled land is just it's depleted so rapidly in the last 60 years, and most of those people are not able to return to the places where they were born.
Sure.
The diaspora is all over the world now.
Mhm.
I'm curious.
I think that shows. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask. You said that prior to this whole thing that it was a very diverse place where your family was from, and I'm kind of curious as to now. Gaza. I mean, I'd imagine it's totally different. But if you could sort of shed any light on, as far as the cultural diversity goes, how much it is different.
Oh, sure. I mean, I've met friends of my family that were not Palestinian, but grew up with my parents in Palestine, for whatever reasons that their parents or their families had settled on that beautiful land, and now, I don't think other than the diversity in occupied territories is probably more. I mean, okay, so the people who live in the occupied territories, in most cases, from what I know, identify as Palestinians, right? Not as Muslims, not as Christians, not as Jews, but as Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
There's still great religious diversity in the occupied territories. Once you cross that border into Israel, these people, of course, strongly identify, again, from my knowledge, as Israelis, but not just Israelis, strictly as Jewish Israelis, right? And if you look back into history, the Jewish community was very strong and very well and alive in Palestinian culture and society there. And, a lot of the people, large amounts of the population that strictly recognized as Israelis were not originally from Arabia or from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
They were from Eastern Europe and things, areas of that nature. And nowadays, I mean, they're from all over the globe, right? There's a big push for Jews who support Israel to move to Israel and occupy more space. So, I mean, yeah, of course, there's a huge change in diversity, and it's all based on what side of the wall you're on, you know what I mean? Imagine that. I can't even, loving people the way that I do, regardless of their religion or ethnic background in this country, in America, that's probably the biggest privilege I have here, is being able to identify and empathize and just live with people of different backgrounds. You know what I mean? There's no escaping what the people in Gaza and the West Bank are walled in with, literally walled in 20-foot concrete walls. Stopping you from experiencing life in diversity on all sides. Palestinians are not recognized as citizens anywhere in the world. They're not allowed to leave their borders. So even if they wanted to experience another culture or be open and empathize with, other people in the world, not that they don't empathize with the other struggles going on, in the world, but, they can't really experience that, right? And, but they're diverse, I'm sure, within their boundaries, but it's definitely a complete, different situation in terms of diversity than it used to be. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'll say that, the United States, in the European countries to an extent, certainly in the United States, very culturally, ethnically diverse. I'm the first one to call out the United States on its structural racism and intolerance, though. And it certainly exists, and we've seen evidence of that very recently. And certainly we have a troubling problem with race in this country, but we don't have a literal wall. I mean, Gaza, it's inhuman. It's this open air refugee camp. And it's just the level of repression there is stunning. It's shocking to me that in 2014, we see it other places, North Korea, for example, just inhuman treatment of people. We see it in various parts of the world, various parts of Africa, but Israel, supposedly a very modern democratic country, if you believe the narrative that we're told here. But it doesn't seem to be fitting with democracy to do this to people.
Not by any means. And you're right, I mean, systematically, America has its flaws when it comes to racism and equal opportunity, definitely. But being first generation and I mean, having family that has it's not just systematic there, right?
It's real. It's very
real.
Yeah.
It's the only reality that is known. It is the only reality that is known, and it is the only reality until there is, international action and things actually made to be done about the situation. It's the only reality that they can know. I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule where people somehow escape their borders, but this is, that's the rule pretty much. You're born there, and you're never going to leave. And
right.
It's made so that even Palestinians who, are displaced globally, are discouraged from going there because of all the hardships that they face in just trying to go visit their family, or all the hassles that they receive or that they're put through just to do simple actions to support or rather to denounce human suffering, right? And in that way, so it's a lot bigger of an issue, I think. I guess I can't say that. Never mind. But human suffering is human suffering, right? I don't want to say it's a bigger issue than our systematic issues here in the States, but we do have a choice on a daily basis to go and learn and interact with one another in the ways that we choose, right? Whereas that is not even a choice for people in Gaza or in the West Bank,
Right. Yeah. Certainly the day-to-day existence is probably a little better in in the European countries in the United States, than being essentially a prisoner in your own land, it seems like the way this is always presented. Noam Chomsky talks about this, and just in a very recent article, actually, he was talking about this. Is that it's presented here as Israel and Palestine, I mean they've both made mistakes and neither of them are acting wholly in the right. They're presented as if it's like an equal narrative, right? When in reality,
Yeah.
Israel holds the entirety of the power in this situation. You have what Chomsky said is that usually what has happened, especially since 2006, is that there will be some kind of deal made, right? Since 2006, it's been Hamas mostly in power in the Palestinian Authority. They will honor this deal. Israel will refuse to end the blockade, right, and go against most of the factors in the treaty, and then and then Israeli violence will escalate to the point where Hamas is forced to respond, at which point Israel does what Chomsky quotes an Israeli official as saying, mow the lawn, which is perhaps one of the most disgusting terms I've ever heard a military figure use.
Sure.
And they will crack down, quote unquote, and you'll have something like this. We had 2005. Let me see. 2009, Operation Cast Lead, which was very similar to this. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. You get a sense of where they're coming from with these names. And then this last Operation Protective Edge, and that cycle has repeated itself from 2006 until now in that same pattern. You can't tell me that this is an equal relationship, that there's equal blame on both sides.
Of course not. As people who are being oppressed have the right to resist, right? I mean, that's like the general, statement for the situation. But this isn't just a norm. This isn't just basic, like we were saying. This isn't just like basic systematic oppression. This is on a daily basis. Oppression to a level at which, these people, even if Palestinians wanted to get, building materials to rebuild their homes, if they wanted to get water to sustain themselves, they don't even have a choice of, a choice to get those kinds of, of resources.
Yeah.
So, resistance in a way for a Palestinian living, especially in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, resistance is existing. Resistance is, demanding that we have water on a daily basis, and not that it's shut off whenever Israeli authorities decide, like you said, God forgive me for using the term, but to mow the lawn, or to, teach people a lesson. Like, what, you're going to teach these people a lesson? You should just stop existing. Like, I mean, there's just absolutely no justice in this situation, and just as, from my understanding, like, the Jewish population was greatly oppressed, and it's something that we should, as a human race, be ashamed of, that we allowed to happen, right, in Europe. But and so in that case, in that desperate situation, right, did they not unite with one another? Did they not try to form, some sort of organization that they could defend themselves through, that would stand up for them? They did. And, we moved past that situation. What's sad is to see that organization took a turn that is exactly like the oppression that oppressed them in the first place, that inspired them to band together and to, stand up for themselves. So history, as it always does, is repeating itself, right?
Exactly.
I mean, of course, it's what these groups, what these political groups in Palestine and the Gaza Strip are doing. Their goal is not to get together to plan grand, a series of bombings. Their goal is not to kill off the race of Jews. It is to, how do we organize ourselves in a respectable way for our local and international communities to stand up for us, to get us clean water, to allow us to have trading rights with any country other than the main country oppressing us. How do we survive, right? And I think you described it very well when you said that it's the times at which things get violent are times when they are forced to turn away from those basic necessity negotiations and face the fact that, hey, we're also physically being terrorized militarily on a daily basis, and we have to, we have to do something about this at this point, and it does take this pattern, but it's, there have been dozens, countless political parties in Palestine,
Yeah.
and I can say, saying from like speaking to people who have supported different political parties in Palestine over the decades, that the basis of, the reason, the passion behind why they form these parties is not for violence, it's not for hatred, it's for survival, right? These groups, what they do, they organize public health services, they organize safety for students who want to go to school, they organize meetings with international people who will increase the quality of their education, the quality of their everyday life. I think from what I know and from the people I've spoken to, the violent side of the issue is really, a distraction. That's the joke. That's the, the first thing on your mind every day when you wake up is, okay, how am I going to eat? How am I going to drink? How am I going to use the restroom? Am I going to be safe when I go to school? Only when it becomes absolutely necessary, when you are being pushed to an extent that on top of not having your basic survival necessities, does it resort in violence?
Right.
I think any human being in that situation, would react similarly.
Right.
So.
If you if you push people hard enough, that's the reaction you're going to get. And
sure.
It's especially the Palestinian political parties historically, Israel and the United States have interfered in Palestinian elections. They have co-opted various political movements. The imperialist powers have done all they could to, interfere with Palestinian sovereignty. And mostly, because, the United States and some of the other countries in the world, Israel began as a client state to larger imperial powers. And they have now turned into a client state that, like, the United States just can't control. It's very clear to me now that the United States just, especially under Netanyahu and the Likud party in Israel, who are warmongers, Israel is really beyond the power of the U.S. government to control. U.S. power has been slipping throughout the world for the last decade or so, but I mean, it's gone now to the point where the situation is terrifyingly unstable, and the level of interference in people's daily lives is just, it's disgusting.
It's inhuman.
It's counter to the principles that keep dignity.
It would not be allowed in any other. Yes.
Totally.
Right. It's a lot easier to criminalize a person who has nothing, right? Because they're going to reach a point of desperation and a place of acting more radically a lot sooner than a person who has everything they need to live on a daily basis, right? Because, something bad happened to me today, that's okay. I still get to go home. I still get to, enjoy my time with my family. Maybe I can vent a little bit. Maybe, I still get to have dinner. I still get to drink water whenever I want. People in desperate situations will reach that threshold a lot sooner. So I think it's, it's just very clear what's actually happening there. And I agree with you, but then I also disagree with you when you say that the United States almost can't control the situation, only because so much funding goes to Israel yearly. I mean, millions and millions of dollars.
Absolutely. The only thing is there's no
anything that's needed.
There's no political calculus in this country that either party you have in power in the United States refuses to cut any of that funding to Israel.
Right.
Barack Obama has shown repeatedly that he doesn't. I'm sorry, the man doesn't have the spine to do it. To stand up to that lobby in the United States and to Netanyahu and to cut that funding. But you're right. It would be very simple for the United States just to say, okay, we're not giving you any more money.
Sure. And lobbying has not always been a regular part of the political process, and surely not a part of the democratic process. And so just as maybe not just as easily as it came in, it can go out. But if democracy and a fair political process ever existed before lobbying, it can be found again. A lot of these lobbyists, it really just comes down to money. Obviously, that's what lobbying is all about. A lot of them are just making so much money. I mean, the state of Israel is even making so very much money off of. It's quite brutal, but they have the technology to create weapons, and they have the occupied territories to try out those weapons, and then they have the international market to sell these weapons and to say, look, this is how well our new product works. I see what you're trying to do to your people here, or I see what you're trying to do in this military situation, wherever it may be in the world. This product will help you do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
God, isn't that sad?
That's
it's
the most disgusting thing I know that's happening in our world today, actually.
Well, it is. I just read an article about how these the weapons countries. The United States, we just started bombing the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant.
Sure.
This odd supposed new caliphate group, right? And the weapons companies are making huge amounts of money because we're putting in new orders for bombs, and Tomahawk missiles and all these things. There's people making money from human suffering and death. War has always been profitable, but I don't think it's ever been more profitable than it is now.
I agree.
And you're right. It is. It's essentially a testing ground. I mean, they've got a walled-in area where they can test munitions. That's a disgusting. That's abhorrent. Oh.
It is.
Yeah. The numbers.
I've actually read that I've read that in the past, some of the worst, dictatorships in the past 20 years, it was released that their supplier of weapons was, Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, if it's not obvious through even just these scenarios that we keep seeing through the breaking of every treaty or every plan that is ever created between Palestinians and the Israeli government, they have no interest whatsoever in peace. Not just peace in their own territory. No, not peace anywhere. I don't relate to this, but when you're making so much money off of something, why would you stop? Why would you encourage peace when you're making so much money?
Right. Yeah.
Keeping turmoil alive in the world.
Capitalist calculus,
Mm-hmm.
It's just the bottom line. Yeah,
right.
It is abhorrent. It's.
Because ultimately, the ultimate purpose of all this was to just get rid of the Palestinians, right? So essentially, that's what would make Israel happy, right? If just all the Palestinians just got up and left, right? That's like the whole.
Sure.
That was the underlying purpose of this whole thing to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And now it just seems like it's going on so unnecessarily creating so much human suffering just to propagate this that you would think that the only real reason behind it is just money. You know, just keep it going, just keep the suffering alive, just to keep making the dollars.
You know, just like, you know, I mean, they want the oil off the coast. You know what I mean? If they could get rid of, you know, if they could get rid of, you know, the Palestinians in Gaza, you know, well, they could go
nearly 2 million people living in the, you know, I believe I read it's the third most densely populated, what's considered a ghetto on Earth. You know, nearly 1.8 million people in that small space. So there's no way that you could unleash an offensive or nearly do anything to that people, to that territory without greatly affecting, you know, at least hundreds, if not thousands, all in one action. And, you know, so imagine the good that could be done, right? The small amount of good that could be done in such a densely populated place, right? But yes, I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I mean, you made that point perfectly. You know, especially, you know, it is such a small space, right? You know, it's 75%. The UN says 69 to 75% Palestinian dead civilians, right? And this is upwards of 2,100 people, right? A great portion of those were children. You know, honestly, these are numbers. You know, just anybody listening, you know, go on and just look at some of the images. This place, you know, it is so densely populated. You know, Israel, they'll call ahead and say that they're going to drop bombs in 5 minutes. Well, where the hell are you supposed to go? You know.
And let me, you know, the call that you mentioned, the call is not, it's not a siren. It's not a phone call. It's not a human interaction. It's a smaller bomb being dropped on your roof, right?
Right.
You could imagine all the things we get spooked about if we're in our homes alone, all the things that you could mistake a sound for. Imagine every second mistaking a creak in your home for a mini bomb that is telling you, oh, hey, in the next, you know, 5 minutes, you might get, you know, your home might be completely demolished by, you know, a huge bomb. You know, so that kind of, I mean, that not only physically but psychologically, imagine that, like what I'm scared of when I hear a branch screech across my window. I get freaked out. But I know that I don't have to run out of my home. I don't have to leave my bed. I don't have to gather all the things that I possibly can and get out of my house. You know, oh man, that's just, it's funny that it's even called a warning, because it causes damage alone. It's broken in. I mean, those warning bombs will explode. You know, will damage your roof, your ceiling. You will have a big gaping hole before the actual offensive even hits you. Wow. You know what I mean? So really, it's not a warning call by any means. It's like it's. I don't even know what to call it.
Yeah, it's you know, it's terrifying. You know, it's just terrifying, and it seems until you dig underneath the surface, of course, it seems so completely senseless. But you know, then you realize the political motivations, you know, the financial motivations for this, you know, and it's just truly. It gets to the point, honestly, where I was watching all this unfold. And it becomes so incredibly saddening and frustrating that you can't even process it anymore. You know, sure. Like just the unbearable inhumanity of this kind of, you know, warfare. It's you know, and God, I know people are going to go crazy at me for saying this, but this has the propensity to become full-on genocide, you know.
Agreed.
And you know, I will be more than happy to argue with people on this. I mean, the UN has definitions of genocide, and this meets like 4 of the criteria.
Sure. Yeah. And you know, that ties back to, you're saying the false narrative of this being an equal fight, right? To this, and calling it a war even says that we agree that yes, there are two sides here. They both have, if not equal, close to equal military, strength, and that they're both accountable for the violence. When in fact, that is not true. It is a genocide. I will stand by that statement all day. This is completely unequal. There is barely even a military. There wasn't in the beginning before the occupation because there is no need, and there isn't now because there's no way to even form a structure like that when, like we said, when you're worried about survival every day, when you don't even have the basic necessities you need to make a meal, how would you find the, advanced technological, needs that you need to form an actual military? And they say that it's 50 to 75% civilians killed. Well, when I think of that, I think, no, all of those people were civilians killed, because even the people fighting, even the people who are organized and might carry out, the small percentage of violence in the ways that they can, are civilians. Those are the people who have been pushed past that threshold. And before they passed that threshold, they were just civilians. And after they passed that threshold, they just became angry civilians.
Right.
They didn't get some awesome training or a sweet, boot camp. They didn't, these are just, fathers and brothers and sons who have been pushed past that threshold and are just trying to, stand for whatever they have left, which is not very much.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It is. How do you find a combatant in Gaza or the West Bank? A group of guys with AK-47s in a pickup truck is not a military force.
Sure.
You couldn't describe that as a military force anywhere in the world. There are probably armed American militia groups out in the hills who have better training and weaponry than these people have.
Yes.
So it's kind of just like a sad joke to say that in any way, shape, or form can the Palestinians resist. Even the missiles and mortar attacks, which Israel so always kind of blames for their intervention, they do almost no damage to Israel.
Sure.
More people actually were killed in traffic accidents in Israel last year than were in these missile attacks.
Mm-hmm.
It's ineffective, and it's just done out of desperation, I think.
Right. There's definitely no excuse for violence in my book, right? But I've never been struggling that bad, and I know people who have witnessed the everyday lives of Israelis, and it's not the same struggle that there may be systematic oppression similar to what the Western world has in place, but at least it's very subtle. At least you can go live your life every day, and as I said, I don't think the goals of the people resisting in violent ways are, yes, let's kill as many Israelis as we possibly can know. It's, let's show that we're still here. I know that this isn't going to do anything anyways, because the technology that, the world supplies, Israel, and the funds that they supply them to do the research to protect themselves is going to diminish this bomb in the sky and make it look like a shooting star. But at least it'll be known that we do survive. We are still here. We still exist, and that at whatever time they had to resort to that kind of action, that we might not be able to do much about it right now, but, we are here. It almost sometimes seems, even for Palestinians not living in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, it's an identity crisis every day to be a Palestinian, to constantly hear the narrative that, Palestinians are insignificant, that this conflict is an equal conflict, when my family has the exact opposite. I know that my parents and my family were not, some terrorist group, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I don't want to condone violence, but, you can, when you look into the story, when you find the facts, I think it comes back to, when you're oppressed, you have a right to resist. And if the kind of oppression they're facing allows for that to be the kind of resistance that, they have to show.
Right. Nobody wants to condone violence. I think that, the end point that all of us are trying to struggle for is to end the violence there. And what it's going to require is, Israel being shamed into actually approaching a peace process, and I don't think that's going to happen under Netanyahu or the Likud party. It's very conservative, very right wing, very tied in with,
Sure.
Global business interests. There are a lot of very progressive parties in Israel, though. And I think if we can get a hold of, some of that and kind of bring them into a position where they can forge a lasting peace in this situation, we can end this. I think a lot of, especially in this round of violence, we have this outpouring of grassroots people saying, that this has got to end. And I think a lot of that is because of social media. There's so many people now who, anybody with a camera phone can document what's happening. The Israelis don't have a media, monopoly on this anymore.
Sure.
Sure.
So the rest of the world gets to see instantaneously, oh my God, this is what's happening. And I think that's going to be vital, in ending this, just to shame the Israeli government into finally sitting down at a peace table, with actual open arms, with intentions to follow through on their agreements.
Yeah. Intentions.
Yeah.
I'd like to, you're right. This has gotten a lot more publicity. A lot of things that weren't being represented before have been represented a lot more recently. My parents have even, been shocked that so many people even know what Palestine is. Instead of asking me where I'm from, and when I tell them Palestine, they say, "Oh, East Palestine." People actually know what I'm talking about.
Sorry for the people listening who aren't from this local area. East Palestine is a little town near our city here in Ohio.
Yes, and so, right. I definitely think, of course, knowledge is power, right? So the more people know who know, what's going on, will obviously denounce what's blatantly wrong. And also, I think the most effective way, though, to put pressure on Israel, I honestly don't see them willingly, or any international power being able to force them to change their intentions, right? No matter how many times they sit down and write something on paper as a treaty or whatever. The most productive campaign that I've seen has been the BDS movement, the Boycotts, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. It, as we always refer to, the best success of that kind of organizing was in South Africa, right? You take the money out of the situation that's funding this inhumane treatment and oppression, and then they can't do it anymore. They don't have the funds, they don't have the resources, and then in that case, and only in that case, I think will intentions actually change, because there won't be another choice, right? And they've made progress in the past couple years, this BDS movement, and there are companies pulling out of Israel due to the campaign. You know what I mean? Nobody wants to support a company that supports that kind of that supports genocide. And that's not everybody. We don't always look that far into the products that we buy, right? But the tools to make it easy for us to look into where our products come from are becoming increasingly popular, right? I believe there's like a smartphone app called Boycott, Buycott, and it allows you to scan barcodes and follow movements that you want to support, and it will tell you whether that barcode falls within any of those movements boycott lists. So, and it's not just for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's it's for everything. You could only want to buy organic. You could only want to buy fair trade or what have you. And that's actually been something that I've used a lot in the past couple years to help me, avoid products that I know would support the occupation and the genocide of Palestinians, because there's not always a lot that we can do other than take away the funding. And I'm not a senator or a congressman or the president, so what I know I can do falls within boycotting and divesting and sanctions from companies that support or choose to look away from the fact that they are supporting that kind of occupation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, and I think those are great resources. It's you say about presidents and senators, the people in power are seem to be unwilling to help with any of the major problems the world faces, right? It is ultimately up to us as human beings to change these things, and I think that's better. We as our own communities, as individuals, we have the power to do this if we choose to.
Yes.
And what we need to do is organize and find dynamic solutions to these problems, because we can. There's an old quote, and I'm not going to be able to place the exact quote, but if the quote is, they say one person can't change the world, but in fact it's the only thing that ever has. We can do this. It just takes
Definitely.
the will.
Sure.
It takes peeling yourself away from mainstream culture as well.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And these are things we talk about a lot. There are other subjects, but removing yourself from mainstream culture, trying to avoid being part of the capitalist system as much as you can, trying to avoid impacting the world negatively by your own actions.
And just educating yourself. Educating yourself on and in as non-biased way as possible.
Right. I think even if you're, whether you are or are not working towards a certain campaign, or, if you want to be an aware, a humbled, a down, what's the word I'm looking for? A good person. I think, at least by my standards, I look for the truth, right? I seek the truth, and it doesn't mean that I'm, up to date all the time on every crisis that's occurring or every injustice that's occurring in the world. But like you were saying, Eric, that in your individual life, that you try to minimize your negative impact every day. And I think, all those other big influences and big campaigns that we end up supporting fall into place after you start to realize within yourself, okay, I'm going to stop doing this every day, or stop doing that, or I'm going to try to buy local. And it just puts humans back into humanity instead of, this, I don't know, made up capitalistic system that we have that kind of takes us away from like what it really means to be human, what it really feels like to be human, what we truly are. I think that's at the root of things, is when we remove ourselves, the further we remove ourselves from our natural state, physically, emotionally, mentally, the crazier things are going to get, right? Because that's unnatural.
Yeah, exactly. The more we distance ourselves from, real human interaction, real humanity, real human emotion, I think the worse things get. And I think that's how we've ended up with the world that we have now.
I agree. I don't think that it's impossible to get back there. I actually think that there's like a big wave of a big demand for a return to, a more simplistic, more holistic lifestyle now. And I can't say that it'll solve all the problems in the world, but I can say I think that it's definitely a big start. I definitely have become more, aware of the situations in my community, and been able to support other people's issues, which then in cause helps me better understand and support the Palestinian issue in a more educated fashion, and allow me to have the resources and meet the people that will support the kind of lifestyle that will minimize human suffering, I think, in some, grand scheme of things. So it really does start with the individual, but, it's important to remember that, it's not just our communities that we're working for, right? It's like that bigger picture of like all communities everywhere. It just has to start with us.
Exactly. I completely agree.
Absolutely.
I completely agree. Salam, it's been a lot of fun. Do you want to say anything else? Do you have anything you want to talk about? Anything you want to promote?
Well, I again want to mention and encourage folks to check out the BDS movement, Boycotts, Divestments, and Sanctions. It's bdsmovement.net. That's their website. And the Boycott app, definitely. Also, just a big thank you to, my parents for educating me on my history. And to you fellas, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and I am honored that you would think to have me on your podcast.
Well, we really enjoyed it, and we'd like you to come back on at some point, because I know there's a lot of community projects you do around here that I'd love to talk to you about. So
definitely.
Yeah, thank you, Salam.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Free Radical Media Podcast.